Some nights, the loneliness cuts deeper than the Montana winter wind. Eliza May Barnes knew this pain well as she worked her small homestead alone, her husband's grave still fresh with snow. When she found a half-frozen stranger outside her barn, she brought him inside and fed him hot stew. The man called himself Mr. Gray and helped with chores for days. He listened as she talked about her late husband and the land she loved. She had no idea this quiet stranger owned every major ranch in Montana. He was the richest cattle baron in the territory, but he sat by her fire like any other traveler. Days passed, and she found herself looking forward to his company. What would happen when she learned the truth about who he really was? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The homestead sat like a small prayer against the vastness of Montana territory, its log walls weathered but sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney into the grey December sky of 1887. Eliza May Barnes stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick curtains across the land that had cost her everything and given her nothing but heartache. Yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. Thomas's farming tools hung in the barn exactly where he'd left them. 8 months ago, the plough he'd sharpened with such care, the harness he'd mended by lamplight, the scythe that had cut their first decent hay crop. She'd had offers from neighbors to buy them, good offers that would have helped with the mounting bills, but her hands trembled every time she reached for them. Those tools weren't just metal and wood, they were Thomas's dreams made manifest, his belief that they could build something lasting in this unforgiving country. She remembered the day they'd first seen this land, how Thomas had walked the boundaries with long, confident strides, his dark hair catching the autumn light as he pointed out where they'd build the house, where they'd plant the garden, where their children would play. He'd been so certain, so full of plans. "This is it, Eliza May," he'd said, taking her hands in his work, roughened ones. "This is where we'll grow old together." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her that he'd been right about one thing: he would never grow old anywhere else. The fever had taken him in April, swift and merciless as a spring storm. She'd nursed him through 3 days of delirium, holding cool cloths to his burning forehead, while he called out for his mother and spoke of crops they'd never plant together. When the end came, it was so quiet, she almost missed it, just a long exhale, like a sigh of relief. Now winter pressed against the windows with icy fingers, and Eliza struggled to keep the fire burning bright enough to hold back the dark. The woodpile was running low, and she'd been stretching meals further each day, making a pot of beans last 3 days instead of 2. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that Thomas had saved 6 months to buy, caught the firelight as she stirred the stew. She'd grown thinner since his death, the ring loose on her finger, but she couldn't bear to remove it. It was all she had left of the woman she'd been when love felt possible. The morning she'd found the stranger, she'd been checking the animals before dawn, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The barn door creaked against the wind, and there he was, a tall man collapsed against the wooden wall, his dark coat crusted with ice, his face pale as death. For a moment, she'd thought he was already gone, but then she'd seen the slight rise and fall of his chest. Common sense should have made her cautious. A woman alone had to be careful about strangers, especially in winter, when desperate men might do desperate things. But something about his stillness, the way his hands were folded peacefully across his chest, reminded her of Thomas in his final moments. She couldn't leave him to die. Getting him inside had been no easy task. He was a big man, well-built and solid, and dead weight in her arms. She'd half-carried, half-dragged him through the snow to the house, her muscles screaming in protest. Once inside, she'd pulled off his frozen boots and coat, wrapped him in every quilt she owned, and spooned warm broth between his blue lips until color began to return to his face. He'd awakened slowly, like a man surfacing from deep water. His eyes, when they finally opened, were the color of summer storm, clouds gray with hints of blue that seemed to shift with his mood. He'd tried to speak, but she'd hushed him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Rest now," she'd said. There's time for talking later. That had been 4 days ago, and true to his word, he'd been a man of few words since. He'd given his name as Mr. Grey, nothing more, and seemed content to help with chores and sit quietly by the fire in the evenings. There was something peaceful about his presence, the way he moved through her small world without disrupting its rhythms. He chopped wood with the steady efficiency of a man who knew hard work, fed the animals with gentle hands, and repaired a loose board on the porch without being asked. What struck her most was how he listened. When she found herself talking about Thomas, about the land, about her fears for the future, he gave her his complete attention. Not the distracted nodding of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the deep listening of someone who understood that words were precious things, not to be wasted. Thomas always said this land would test us, she'd told him the second evening, as they sat by the fire after supper. He said it would ask us what we were really made of. Mr. Grey had looked up from the harness. He was mending another of Thomas's tools that had been neglected since his death. And what did you tell it? The question had caught her off guard. Most people offered comfort or advice when she spoke of Thomas. Mr. Grey simply asked what she thought, as if her opinion mattered. I told it I was made of stubbornness and grief, she'd answered after a long moment. I'm not sure that's enough. He'd smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Stubbornness built most of the West, Mrs. Barnes. Grief just means you loved something worth fighting for. She'd felt something shift inside her chest at those words, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, like she was more than just a widow to be pitied or a problem to be solved. The neighbors meant well, but their visits always left her feeling more alone. Martha Henderson from the next homestead over would arrive with casseroles and thinly veiled questions about her plans. You can't stay out here alone forever, dear, she'd say, her voice dripping with concern. A woman needs protection, especially in winter. James Miller, who ran the general store in town, had been more direct. I could give you a fair price for the land, Eliza May, enough to get you back east where you belong. This country's too hard for a woman alone. Even Pastor Williams, well-meaning as he was, seemed to think her continued presence on the homestead was somehow improper. The Lord helps those who help themselves, he'd said during his last visit. Sometimes that means knowing when to let go. But letting go felt like betraying Thomas's memory, like admitting that everything they'd worked for was meaningless. This land held their shared dreams, their whispered plans for the future. In the spring, they'd intended to plant apple trees near the house. Thomas had already marked the spots with wooden stakes, now barely visible beneath the snow. How could she abandon that? Mr. Grey seemed to understand without explanation. On the third day, she'd found him standing near those stakes, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful. Apple trees? He'd asked when she joined him. Thomas's idea. He said we'd need shade for the children. The words had come out before she could stop them, and she'd felt heat rise in her cheeks. There would be no children now, no need for shade trees. But Mr. Grey had only nodded. Good soil for it, protected from the north wind, plenty of morning sun. He had a good eye for the land. It was the first time since Thomas's death that anyone had spoken of his dreams as if they'd been real and valuable, not just the foolish hopes of a man who died too young. She'd stood there in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, and felt something like gratitude warm her from the inside. That evening, she'd pulled out the tintype photograph of Thomas from her jewelry box and showed it to Mr. Grey. In the picture, Thomas stood beside their first successful vegetable garden, his sleeves rolled up, his face bright with pride. He looked so young, so full of life. He was a good man, she'd said, studying the image. Everyone said so. Patient, kind, never spoke ill of anyone. He deserved better than this place gave him. Mr. Grey had examined the photograph with the same careful attention he gave everything else. He looks happy. He was. Right up until the end, he believed we could make it work. She traced Thomas's face with her finger, remembering the feel of his beard, the way he'd hum while he worked. Sometimes I think he was the only one who did. And now, she'd looked up, meeting those storm-grey eyes. Now I don't know what I believe anymore." The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Mr. Gray had handed back the photograph with careful reverence. "Belief is a luxury when you're just trying to survive," he'd said quietly. "But surviving long enough, sometimes belief comes back on its own." She'd put the picture away, but his words had stayed with her. There was something about the way he spoke, not like a drifter or a hired hand, but like a man who'd wrestled with his own questions about faith and purpose. It made her curious about his story, though she sensed he wasn't ready to share it. The fourth night, as she prepared supper, she'd found herself humming for the first time since Thomas's death. It was an old hymn her mother had sung, and the melody came back to her as naturally as breathing. Mr. Gray had looked up from his mending, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Pretty song," he'd said. "My mother used to sing it while she cooked, said it made the food taste better." She'd paused, ladle in hand, struck by the realization. "I haven't hummed in months." "Grief has its own seasons," he'd replied. "Maybe winter's finally breaking." She'd served him an extra portion of stew that night, and he'd accepted it with quiet thanks. As they ate, she'd found herself studying his hand, strong and calloused, but with a certain refinement that spoke of education and breeding. His clothes, too, were well made beneath the wear of travel. Good wool, quality stitching, not the rough garments of a common laborer. "Have you always been a traveling man, Mr. Gray?" she'd asked, emboldened by his kindness. He'd paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Not always. I had a place once, but it never felt like home." "What happened to it?" "Still there, far as I know, just not where I belong anymore." He'd taken another bite, chewing thoughtfully. "Sometimes you have to leave everything behind to find what you're really looking for." She'd wanted to ask more, but something in his expression had warned her away. They'd finished their meal in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. When he'd offered to help with the dishes, she'd accepted another small pleasure she'd forgotten, the simple companionship of shared tasks. Now, as she prepared for their fifth day together, Eliza found herself looking forward to his presence in a way that both comforted and frightened her. She was a widow still deep in mourning, and he was a stranger who might disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel entirely alone in the world. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting everything in silver and gold. Mr. Gray was already up. She could hear him moving around in the barn, tending to the animals with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Soon he'd come in for breakfast, and they'd sit together at her small table, sharing simple food and careful conversation. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The fifth morning brought the kind of cold that made the air itself seem brittle. Eliza woke before dawn to find ice crystals on the inside of her windows, and Mr. Gray, already dressed, stoking the fire back to life with practiced ease. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her, and she lay still for a moment, watching him work in the dim light. There was something graceful about his movements, a confidence that spoke of a man accustomed to being in control of his circumstances. His coat, she noticed, was finer than she'd first thought wool, so dark it was almost black, with silver buttons that caught the firelight. When he pulled out his pocket watch to check the time, she glimpsed something that made her breath catch. The chain was gold, heavy and ornate, and the watch itself gleamed with the unmistakable sheen of expensive craftsmanship. She closed her eyes quickly as he turned, pretending sleep, but her mind raced. A man carrying a watch like that wasn't the common drifter she'd assumed. The revelation left her unsettled, like discovering a familiar room had doors she'd never noticed. When she rose and dressed, Mr. Gray was already outside, his breath steaming in the frigid air as he broke ice on the water trough. She joined him with a bucket of warm water from the stove, and together they tended to the animals. The milk cow, Bessie, had always been skittish with strangers, but she stood placidly for Mr. Gray, as if sensing his competent hands. "You're good with livestock," Eliza observed, watching him gentle a nervous hen back to her roost. "Had some experience over the years," He straightened, brushing straw from his coat. Animals know when someone understands them. They respond to confidence and kindness. Like people, I suppose. He smiled at that. A real smile that reached his eyes. More honest than most people in my experience. They worked in comfortable rhythm, Mr. Gray anticipating what needed doing before she could ask. When the barn door stuck in its frozen frame, he applied just the right pressure to free it without forcing. When the feed bucket developed a crack, he repaired it with a few deft movements that spoke of someone who'd solved countless such problems. Over breakfast, Eliza found herself studying him more carefully. His hands, she noticed, were calloused but clean, the nails well kept. When he spoke, his grammar was precise, his vocabulary that of an educated man. Yet he wore his learning lightly, never condescending or showing off. "Tell me about your Thomas," he said as they shared the last of the coffee. "How did you two meet?" The question surprised her with its directness, but his tone was gentle, genuinely interested. She found herself telling him about the church social where she'd first seen Thomas, how he'd been too shy to ask her to dance until her friend Martha had practically pushed them together. "He stepped on my feet twice during that first dance," she said, smiling at the memory. "But he was so apologetic, so earnest about it, that I couldn't help but laugh. He had this way of making everything seem possible, even his two left feet becoming graceful. Sounds like a good man to build a life with." He was. Everyone said we were well matched, both quiet, both serious about making something of ourselves. She paused, stirring her coffee, though it needed no stirring. "I used to think I knew what love was supposed to look like. Steady, predictable, safe. Thomas was all of those things." "Used to think?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. "I don't know what I think anymore about anything." Mr. Gray nodded slowly. "Grief has a way of changing how we see everything. What felt certain before suddenly seems fragile." "Did you lose someone?" The words were out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "It's all right." He set down his cup, his expression distant. "I lost the woman I thought I'd marry, though not to death." She decided she preferred someone with better prospects. A bitter smile touched his lips. Turned out she was right to leave, in the end. I wasn't the man she thought I was. Eliza felt a surge of protective anger on behalf of this quiet stranger. Then she was a fool. Was she? I let her believe things about me that weren't true. When she found out who I really was, she realized she'd fallen in love with a lie. He met Eliza's eyes. Sometimes we become so afraid of being rejected for who we really are that we forget to be ourselves at all. There was something in his voice, a note of deep regret, that made her want to reach across the table and take his hand. Instead, she refilled his coffee cup, a small gesture of comfort. What was her name? Margaret. Beautiful, accomplished, everything a man could want in a wife. Or so I thought. He stared into his cup, as if seeing the past in its dark surface. She taught me that wanting someone and being right for them are very different things. "And now, do you ever think about settling down again?" He looked up then, and something in his grey eyes made her pulse quicken. "I'm beginning to think I never knew what settling down really meant before." The words created a charged silence between them. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away, suddenly aware of how intimate their conversation had become. This man was still essentially a stranger, yet she'd shared more with him in 5 days than she'd shared with anyone since Thomas's death. "I should check the root cellar," she said, standing abruptly. "Make sure the potatoes haven't frozen." But as she moved past his chair, he caught her hand gently. His touch was warm, calloused, and entirely different from Thomas's smaller, softer hands. The contrast sent an unexpected thrill through her. Eliza May. Her name sounded different in his voice, like something precious. "I want you to know these past few days have meant more to me than you could possibly understand." She looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was dangerous, this growing awareness of him as a man, rather than simply a guest. She was still a grieving widow, still wearing her wedding ring, still sleeping in the bed she'd shared with Thomas. "Mr. Gray, my friends call me Silas," he said quietly. Silas. The name felt strange on her tongue, personal in a way that Mr. Gray had not been. "I don't know what I'm doing here. This isn't I'm not ready for." "I know." He released her hand, but remained close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes. "I'm not asking for anything you can't give." But that was the problem, wasn't it? She was beginning to fear she might give him more than was wise, more than was proper for a woman in her situation. The way he looked at her made her remember what it felt like to be desired, and the way he listened made her feel understood in ways Thomas never had. "I need some air," she said, and escaped to the porch before he could respond. Outside, the cold bit at her cheeks and cleared her head. She stood there for long minutes, breathing deeply and trying to make sense of what was happening to her. When she finally went back inside, Silas was washing the breakfast dishes, his movements careful and practiced. "Thank you," she said, and meant more than just the dishes. "Thank you for letting me stay." That afternoon, they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. Silas proved surprisingly knowledgeable about construction and ranching, offering suggestions that showed real expertise. When she mentioned her struggles with the farm's finances, he listened without judgment or unsolicited advice. Thomas had such plans for expanding, she told him as they secured a new fence post. He wanted to increase the herd, maybe even get into horse breeding. But without him, she shrugged helplessly. "I don't know the first thing about business." "What do you know?" "How to work hard, how to make do with less, how to keep going when everything seems hopeless." She hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "Not exactly marketable skills." "Those are exactly the skills that matter most out here." Silas held the board steady while she worked. "The rest can be learned." There was something in his tone, a confidence about business matters that surprised her. Most drifters wouldn't know much about expanding farms or managing herds, yet he spoke as if these were familiar concepts. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, she found herself really looking at him not just as a guest or even as a man, but as a mystery she was only beginning to understand. His clothes, his mannerisms, his way of speaking all suggested someone far removed from the rough frontier life she knew. "Silas," she said carefully, "what did you do before you started traveling?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if each word was chosen with care. "I was in business, cattle mostly. Did well enough, but I got tired of the life it required." He poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Too much time thinking about money, not enough time thinking about what makes life worth living. So you just walked away." Sometimes walking away is the only honest thing to do. She wanted to ask more, but something in his posture warned her off. Instead, she pulled out her mending and worked in companionable silence while he whittled a piece of wood into what might become a toy horse. The domestic scene felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream of what life could be. When she rose to bank the fire for the night, their eyes met across the small room. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger in equal measure. She was standing at the edge of something that could change everything, and they both knew it. "Good night, Silas," she said softly. "Good night, Eliza May." But as she lay in her bed that night, listening to him settle onto the makeshift pallet by the fire, she knew that whatever was beginning between them had already gone far beyond simple gratitude or companionship. The man sleeping in her front room was awakening feelings she'd thought buried with Thomas, and she had no idea what to do about it. Outside, the wind howled across the empty prairie, but inside, something warm and dangerous was taking root in the frozen ground of her heart. The 6th day brought Martha Henderson to the door, her arms laden with fresh bread and her eyes bright with curiosity. Eliza had been kneading dough when she heard the approaching wagon, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron before stepping outside to greet her neighbor. "Eliza May, dear," Martha called, climbing down from her wagon with practiced ease. "I brought you some of my sourdough and thought I'd see how you're managing in this dreadful cold." Behind Martha came her husband John, a solid man with kind eyes who tipped his hat to Eliza. But both Hendersons stopped short when Silas emerged from the barn, an armload of freshly split wood in his arms. "Martha, John, this is Mr. Gray," Eliza said, trying to keep her voice casual. "He was caught in the storm a few days ago, and I've been giving him shelter until the weather breaks." Martha's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, and John's expression grew carefully neutral. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, a strange man staying with a widow was bound to cause talk. "Mr. Gray," John said with a polite nod, "you picked a hard time to be traveling." "That I did." Silas set down the wood and extended his hand. "I'm grateful for Mrs. Barnes's kindness. Would have frozen to death without it." John shook the offered hand, and Eliza watched his expression change subtly. There was something about Silas's grip, his bearing, that commanded respect even from men who worked hard for a living. "Well," Martha said, still staring at Silas with frank curiosity, "you're welcome to join us for coffee. I brought extra." They gathered around Eliza's small table, and she pulled out her mother's recipe book to guide her in making coffee for a larger group. The worn pages fell open to her mother's handwriting, the careful script detailing not just ingredients, but little notes about family preferences and special occasions. "Your mother's recipes?" Martha asked, noticing the book. "Yes. She wrote everything down, even the simplest things. Said a family's recipes were part of its history." Eliza traced one of the faded ink lines with her finger. "I've been using them to cook for Mr. Gray. Seemed right somehow to share the food that meant something." Silas watched her handle the book with reverence, and something in his expression suggested he understood the deeper meaning of the gesture. When she served him coffee made according to her grandmother's proportions, he took the cup with appropriate gravity. "It's excellent," he said simply, but the way he said it made her feel as if she'd given him something precious. The conversation that followed was careful and polite, but Eliza could sense the undercurrents. John asked general questions about Silas's travels, and while Silas answered readily enough, his responses revealed little. "He'd come from the east," he said, "and was headed west, looking for opportunities." Standard answers that could mean anything or nothing. But when John mentioned his struggles with a sick calf, Silas leaned forward with genuine interest. "What are the symptoms?" he asked, and the questions that followed showed a deep understanding of cattle diseases and their treatments. He suggested a remedy that John hadn't considered, explaining the logic behind it with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with livestock extensively. "That's sound thinking," John admitted, clearly impressed. "You've worked cattle before?" "Some," Silas said, but offered no details. Martha, meanwhile, was studying Eliza with sharp eyes. "You look better, dear," she said finally. "More color in your cheeks. The company must be agreeing with you." Eliza felt heat rise in her face. "Mr. Gray has been very helpful with the chores. It's nice not to do everything alone." "I'm sure it is." Martha's tone was carefully neutral, but Eliza heard the questions underneath. "Of course, people will talk, you know. A widow woman and a strange man." "Let them talk," Silas said quietly. The steel in his voice surprised everyone, including Eliza. Mrs. Barnes showed Christian charity to a stranger in need. Anyone who finds fault with that says more about themselves than about her. John nodded approvingly. "Well said. Eliza May's always been a good woman, and good women deserve respect, not gossip." But after the Hendersons left, promising to check on them again soon, Eliza found herself pacing the small kitchen. "They mean well," she said, more to herself than to Silas. "But Martha's right about people talking. I hadn't thought, I know how it looks. Are you asking me to leave?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she heard the hurt underneath. "No." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "No, I don't want you to leave, but maybe we should think about what's proper." "What's proper," Silas said, standing and moving closer to her, "is that you saved a man's life and asked for nothing in return. What's proper is that I'm trying to repay that kindness by helping with work that's too much for one person. What's not proper is people judging a good woman for having a good heart. His defense of her honor was both touching and troubling. There was an authority in his voice, a way of speaking that suggested he was accustomed to having his opinions carry weight. It made her wonder again about his background, about the life he'd walked away from. That afternoon, when the water pump in the kitchen began making ominous grinding sounds, Silas examined it with the methodical approach of someone solving a familiar problem. He identified the issue quickly, a worn gasket that needed replacement, and somehow produced the right tools to fix it. "How did you know how to do that?" Eliza asked, watching him work with confident precision. "You pick things up over the years." But his explanation felt inadequate. The tools he'd used weren't the rough implements of a traveling man, but quality pieces that spoke of someone who could afford the best. When he finished, the pump worked better than it had in months. Eliza worked the handle, marveling at how smoothly it operated. "Thomas struggled with that pump for weeks before he died," she said. "Never could get it quite right. Different men have different strengths." Silas cleaned his tools carefully before putting them away. Thomas was a farmer, a man who understood growing things. That's a gift not everyone has. "And you? What's your gift?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still busy with the tools. "I used to think it was making money. Now I'm not so sure." That evening, as they shared another meal prepared from her mother's recipes, Eliza found herself studying Silas more openly. The way he held his fork, the way he cut his meat, even the way he chewed spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. Yet he seemed genuinely content with her simple fare, complimenting the food with sincere appreciation. "Silas," she said carefully, "when you said you were in the cattle business show, big of an operation was it?" "Big enough." He took another bite, seemingly focused on his meal. "Why do you ask?" "You just seem to know so much about it. And the way you fixed that pump, the tools you carry." She hesitated, then pressed on. "Most traveling men don't have resources like that." For a moment, she thought he might tell her the truth. His expression grew serious, almost pained, and he set down his fork as if preparing to speak, but then he seemed to think better of it. "I saved my money, bought good tools. They last longer, work better." The explanation was logical but felt incomplete. A man should take pride in his equipment. She wanted to push further, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way his jaw tightened when she asked direct questions, or maybe it was her own fear of what the answers might reveal. If Silas was more than he seemed, what did that mean for whatever was growing between them? That night, after he'd settled by the fire and she'd retreated to her bedroom, Eliza lay awake thinking about trust and truth. Thomas had been an open book, his thoughts and feelings always clearly written on his face. With Silas, she felt like she was reading a story with pages missing, trying to understand a plot with crucial information withheld. But even as she questioned his honesty, she couldn't deny the way her heart lifted when she heard him moving around in the morning, or how the house felt warmer and more alive with his presence. Whatever secrets he carried, the man himself seemed genuine in his care for her. Outside, the wind had died down, and for the first time in days, snow wasn't falling. Maybe the storm was finally breaking, she thought. But as she drifted towards sleep, she realized she wasn't ready for clear skies if they meant Silas would feel obligated to move on. Some storms, she was learning, brought gifts along with the hardship. The 7th morning dawned clear and bright, the first truly beautiful day since Silas's arrival. Eliza woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the sound of him whistling softly as he worked outside. She dressed quickly and found him repairing the chicken coop with the same methodical care he brought to everything. "Beautiful morning," she said, stepping out into air so crisp it made her lungs ache. Too beautiful to waste indoors. He looked up from his work, and she saw something different in his expression, a lightness that hadn't been there before. "Thought maybe you'd like to walk the property with me. Show me those apple tree spots," Thomas marked. The suggestion both thrilled and frightened her. Walking the land together felt intimate, like sharing a sacred space. But she found herself nodding before her caution could override her desire for his company. They set out after breakfast, following the fence line toward the southern boundary of her property. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath created small clouds in the cold air. Silas walked beside her with easy strides, occasionally reaching out to steady her when the footing grew treacherous. "Tell me about your plans for this place," he said as they crested a small hill that overlooked the valley. "Not Thomas's plans, yours." The question caught her off guard. Since Thomas's death, everyone had asked what she intended to do with the property, as if she couldn't possibly have opinions of her own about the land she'd worked alongside her husband. "I never really thought I was allowed to have my own plans," she admitted. "Thomas was so certain about everything, so full of ideas. I just tried to support him." And now, she stopped walking and looked out over the white expanse of her homestead. From this vantage point, she could see the house Thomas had built with his own hands, the barn where they'd sheltered their animals through 2 hard winters, the garden plot where she'd coaxed vegetables from reluctant soil. "Now I think maybe I'd like to try things differently." Thomas wanted to expand, to compete with the big ranchers. But maybe there's something to be said for staying small, doing things well, instead of just doing them big. She glanced at Silas, wondering if he'd think her unambitious. "I'd like to focus on quality, better animals, even if there are fewer of them. Maybe try my hand at breeding horses like I always wanted to." Silas nodded thoughtfully. "Smart approach. The big operations can produce quantity, but there's always a market for quality. Takes more knowledge and patience, but the rewards are better." Again, she was struck by his understanding of business principles that most drifters wouldn't know. "You sound like you've given this considerable thought." "I've seen both approaches work and fail. Size isn't everything sometimes, it's a liability." His voice carried a note of personal experience that made her curious. They walked on, and she found herself sharing dreams she'd never spoken aloud. Her vision of the horse breeding program she'd always wanted to try, her ideas for improving the soil, her hope of maybe teaching school in town during the winter months when farm work was light. Thomas thought teaching was a waste of time, she said as they approached the stakes marking the future apple orchard. Said a farmer's wife had plenty to do without taking on other people's children. "What did you think?" "I thought I missed learning, missed books and discussions about ideas. I taught school for 2 years before we married, and I loved it." She brushed snow off one of Thomas's markers, revealing the carefully carved wood beneath. "But I never argued with him about it. I figured marriage meant putting aside individual dreams for shared ones." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the stakes with serious attention. "Marriage should add to who you are, not subtract from it." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. She'd never thought of it that way before, but now she wondered how much of herself she'd surrendered in the name of being a good wife. "Is that why you never married again? After Margaret?" "Part of it." He turned to face her, his grey eyes serious. "I realized I'd been trying so hard to be what she wanted that I'd lost track of who I actually was. Didn't seem fair to inflict that on someone else until I figured it out." "And have you figured it out?" "I'm beginning to." His voice was soft, and the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken. "Being here, talking with you, it's helped me remember things I'd forgotten about myself." They stood there in the snow, surrounded by the silence of the winter landscape, and Eliza felt the space between them charge with possibility. She was intensely aware of everything about him, the way the cold had reddened his cheeks, the way his breath misted in the air, the way his eyes seemed to see straight into her heart. "Silas," she began, not sure what she meant to say. But he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, and suddenly words seemed unnecessary. When he reached up to touch her cheek with his gloved hand, she didn't pull away. "Eliza May," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I need you to know whatever happens. These days with you have been the most real I've felt in years." She wanted to ask what he meant by whatever happens, but then he was leaning down and she was rising up to meet him, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and desperate all at once. It lasted only moments, but when they broke apart, everything had changed. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though he didn't step away. "No," she agreed, her hand rising unconsciously to touch her lips. You shouldn't have." But neither of them moved, and when he kissed her again, longer this time, and with more certainty, she kissed him back with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally separated, she was trembling, and not from the cold. The sensible part of her mind was screaming warnings about impropriety and grief, and the fact that she barely knew this man. But a deeper part, a part that had been dormant since Thomas's death, was singing with joy. "We should go back," she said, though she made no move to leave. "Yes," he agreed, but his eyes were still on her lips. The walk back to the house was charged with new awareness. Every accidental touch of their hands sent electricity through her, and she found herself sneaking glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. When she caught him doing the same, they both looked away quickly, like guilty children. That evening, she pulled out Thomas's letters, the ones he'd written during their brief courtship when he'd gone to visit his ailing father. She'd kept them in a small wooden box, tied with a blue ribbon, and she'd read them often in the months after his death, seeking comfort in his gentle words of love. But tonight, with Silas sitting across from her by the fire, she found herself sharing them. Not the intimate parts, but the sweet, earnest passages where Thomas wrote about his hopes for their future together. "Listen to this," she said, unfolding one of the yellowed pages. "My dear Eliza May, I dreamed last night that we were old together, sitting on the porch of our house and watching our grandchildren play in the yard. When I woke, I felt such peace, knowing that someday that dream would be real." She looked up to find Silas watching her with an unreadable expression. "He loved you very much." "He did, and I loved him." She folded the letter carefully, but reading his words now, I realized something. He loved the idea of me, the version of me that fit into his dreams. "You," she paused, suddenly shy, "you seem to love the person I actually am." Silas set down the piece of wood he'd been carving and leaned forward. "I do love the person you are, Eliza May. Your strength, your kindness, your way of finding beauty even in hard times. I love how you listen, really listen, when someone speaks. I love how you make a simple meal feel like a feast because you put care into every detail." The words were more than she'd dared hope to hear, and they filled empty places in her heart she hadn't even known existed. But they also frightened her, because they made her want things she wasn't sure she was ready to want. "I'm still wearing his ring," she said quietly, holding up her left hand. "I know." Silas's voice was gentle, "and I'm not asking you to take it off. I'm just asking you to believe that it's possible to honor the past and still reach for the future." That night, she lay in bed with Thomas's letters spread across the quilt, rereading passages that had once brought comfort but now seemed to belong to someone else's life. The woman Thomas had loved had been real, but she'd also been confined by his expectations and her own fear of disappointing him. The woman Silas was falling in love with felt larger somehow, more complete. With him, she could dream of teaching again, of building something uniquely her own, of being both soft and strong. But as she finally gathered the letters to put them away, one question kept nagging at her. Who was Silas Gray, really? And could she trust her heart to a man who hadn't trusted her with the truth about himself? Outside, the wind had picked up again, and she could hear Silas moving restlessly by the fire. They were both awake, both probably thinking about that kiss and what it meant. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new questions. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas's death, she fell asleep feeling genuinely hopeful about her future. The 8th day brought unwelcome visitors. Eliza was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the approach of multiple horses. Through the sheets whipping in the wind, she saw 3 men riding up to her front door, Harold Pemberton from the bank, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. She'd been expecting this visit, but hoping the winter weather might delay it until spring. With numb fingers, she smoothed her hair and walked around to the front of the house, where Silas had already emerged from the barn to stand beside her porch. "Mrs. Barnes," Pemberton called, dismounting from his horse with the self-important air of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. He was a thin, sharp-featured man who wore his authority like an expensive coat. I hope you're well. We need to discuss your situation. Mr. Pemberton. She kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. What brings you out in this weather? Business, I'm afraid. May we come inside? This is a matter that requires privacy. She glanced at Silas, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of support, then led the men into her small front room. Pemberton's companions one, a heavy-set man with cold eyes. The other, younger but equally hard-looking, positioned themselves near the door like guards. Mrs. Barnes, Pemberton began, settling into Thomas's chair without invitation. I'll be direct. Your mortgage payment was due last month, and we've heard nothing from you. The bank cannot continue to extend credit indefinitely. Eliza pulled out the deed to her land from the drawer where she kept her important papers. The document was worn from handling, but every word was burned into her memory. I understand the payment is overdue, Mr. Pemberton, but surely we can work out some arrangement. The bank has been patient, given your recent loss, Pemberton interrupted, his tone suggesting this patience was a great favor. But sentiment doesn't pay debts. You owe $340, plus interest. Without Mr. Barnes's income, you simply cannot maintain this property. The amount hit her like a physical blow. She'd known it was substantial, but hearing it spoken aloud made it seem impossible. If I could just have until spring. Spring won't change your fundamental situation, my dear. A woman alone cannot work a spread this size. The sensible thing is to sell now, before you fall further into debt. Pemberton leaned forward, his voice taking on a tone of false kindness. I happen to represent interests that would be willing to take this burden off your hands. What kind of interests? Silas spoke for the first time, his voice carefully neutral. Pemberton's eyes sharpened as he really looked at Silas for the first time. And you are? A friend of Mrs. Barnes. I see. The banker's gaze traveled over Silas's clothes, his bearing, clearly trying to place him. Well, Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray, the interests I represent are prepared to offer Mrs. Barnes a fair price for her proper enough to pay off her debt and leave her with a small nest egg to start fresh somewhere more suitable for a woman in her circumstances. How much? Eliza asked, though she dreaded the answer. $400 for the entire spread. House, barn, livestock, and all 160 acres. The offer was insultingly low, barely enough to cover her debt with nothing left over. This land was worth at least 3 times that amount, maybe more. Thomas had researched property values extensively before they'd bought it. That's robbery, she said, her voice tight with anger. That's reality, Pemberton replied coldly. Property values have declined since your husband's death. Without proper management, this place will only deteriorate further. Silas stepped closer to Eliza's chair, and she drew comfort from his presence. Mrs. Barnes has been managing quite well, actually. The property is in excellent condition. For now, perhaps. But winter's barely half over, and spring brings its own challenges. Carving season, planting, hay cutting, it's too much for one woman. She's not alone, Silas said quietly, and something in his tone made all 3 visitors look at him more carefully. Pemberton's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting some sort of partnership arrangement, Mr. Gray? Because I should warn you that the bank would require substantial documentation of your financial capacity before considering any transfer of obligation. For a moment, Eliza thought Silas might reveal something about his true circumstances. His jaw tightened, and she saw his hands clench at his sides, but then his expression smoothed. I'm suggesting that Mrs. Barnes deserves more time to consider her options. Time is a luxury she can't afford. Pemberton stood, clearly growing impatient. Mrs. Barnes, I'll need your decision by the end of the month. That gives you 2 weeks to either pay what you owe or accept our offer. After the men left, Eliza sank into her chair and stared at the deed in her trembling hands. 2 weeks. How was she supposed to find $340 in 2 weeks? It's not fair, she said, more to herself than to Silas. Thomas and I worked so hard to build this place. We saved every penny, made every sacrifice. Life rarely cares about fair. Silas knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle. But that doesn't mean you have to accept defeat. What choice do I have? I don't have the money, and I can't earn it in 2 weeks. Maybe Pemberton's right. Maybe I should just take what I can get and start over somewhere else. Is that what you want? She looked around the room Thomas had built with his own hands, the stone fireplace where they'd spent their evenings together, the windows he'd carefully fitted to catch the morning light, the floors he'd sanded smooth with infinite patience. "No," she whispered, "I want to stay. This is home. Then we'll find a way." "We?" She looked at him sharply. "Silas, this isn't your problem. It became my problem the moment I started caring about you." He took her hands in his, and she felt the calloused strength of his fingers. "I won't let them take your home." "How can you stop them? You don't have that kind of money either." For a moment, his expression grew complicated, as if he were wrestling with himself. "There might be ways." "What ways? You're a traveling man with whatever savings you can carry. I can't ask you to bankrupt yourself for me." "You're not asking. I'm offering." His voice carried a strange certainty that both comforted and puzzled her. "Trust me, Eliza May, I won't let you lose this place." That evening, as they shared a quiet supper, she found herself studying him again. His confidence about helping with her financial problems didn't match what she knew about his circumstances. A drifter, no matter how well educated or skilled, wouldn't speak with such certainty about finding $300. "Silas," she said carefully, "when you said there might be ways to help, what did you mean?" He set down his fork and met her eyes. "I meant that sometimes people have resources they don't talk about. Sometimes a man keeps his cards close to his chest until he's sure the game is worth playing." "What kind of resources?" "The kind that come from making good decisions over many years." His answer was maddeningly vague. "The kind that only matter when they're used for something important." She wanted to press him further, but something in his expression warned her away. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I don't understand what you're not telling me," she said softly, "but I'm grateful you're here. Whatever happens with the bank, these past days have meant everything to me." He turned his hand over so their palms touched. "They've meant everything to me too." But as they sat there in the lamplight, hands joined across the table, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that Silas was keeping something enormous from her. His confidence about her financial problems, his knowledge of business, his quality possessions, everything pointed to a man with far more resources than he claimed. The question was whether she could trust him with her future when he wouldn't trust her with his truth. And with only 2 weeks to save her home, she might not have the luxury of waiting for him to decide. The 9th day dawned grey and bitter, with a wind that seemed to cut straight through the walls of the house. Eliza woke to find Silas already gone, his bedroll neatly folded by the cold fireplace. A note on the table, written in his precise handwriting, explained that he'd ridden to town on business and would return by evening. The absence of his presence hit her harder than she'd expected. In just over a week, she'd grown accustomed to the sound of his movements, the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. Now, faced with the familiar silence of her empty house, she felt the weight of her circumstances pressing down like a physical thing. She spent the morning doing busy work, mending clothes that didn't need mending, reorganizing shelves that were already organized, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on Pemberton's ultimatum. But as the hours passed with no sign of Silas's return, anxiety began to gnaw at her. What business could a traveling man have in town that would take all day? The question brought back all her doubts about his true identity, his mysterious confidence about helping with her financial problems, his evasive answers about his past. By late afternoon, when the weak winter sun was already setting, she heard the approach of a horse. But instead of Silas, she found young Billy Henshaw from the general store standing on her porch, his cheeks red with cold and his expression troubled. "Mrs. Barnes, ma'am," he said, pulling off his hat respectfully. "Mr. Miller sent me with a message. There's been some talk in town today, about your friend Mr. Gray." Her stomach clenched. "What kind of talk?" "Well, ma'am, he was asking questions about land prices, about who owns what around here, and the way he was asking like someone who knows business real well. Got folks wondering who he really is." "I see." She kept her voice carefully neutral. Was that all? Billy shifted uncomfortably. No, ma'am. Old Pete Carson was in the store, and he swears he's seen your Mr. Gray before. Says he looks powerful, familiar, but he can't place where. Pete's been in these parts 40 years. She knows every face for 100 miles. After Billy left, Eliza paced the small house like a caged animal. The walls seemed to close in on her as she wrestled with growing certainty that Silas was not who he claimed to be. But if he wasn't a traveling man down on his luck, then who was he? And why had he been asking about land ownership in town? When she heard his horse returning as darkness fell, she was standing at the window, her emotions a tangle of relief and apprehension. He dismounted slowly, his movements suggesting fatigue, and when he stepped into the circle of lamplight from her window, she saw something different in his expression, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. "You're late," she said as he came through the door, stamping snow from his boots. "I'm sorry. Business took longer than expected." He hung his coat on the peg by the door, and she noticed how his eyes avoided hers. "What kind of business, Silas?" The question hung in the air between them. He turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight she could see the conflict playing across his features. "The kind that might help with your situation. Billy Henshaw came by, said you were asking questions in town, about land, about ownership." She crossed her arms, suddenly feeling cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. "What aren't you telling me?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he moved to the fireplace and braced his hands against the mantel, staring into the flames. "There are things about me, about my life that I haven't shared with you. I gathered that much." Her voice was sharper than she'd intended. "The question is why?" "Because I was afraid." He turned to face her, and the raw honesty in his expression caught her off guard. "Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently. Treat me differently. Try me." He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing it. "I'm not who you think I am, Eliza May. I'm not a traveling man looking for work. I'm—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I'm someone who has resources, significant resources." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "You've been lying to me." "Not lying exactly, just not telling you everything." "That's the same thing." Anger flared in her chest, hot and immediate. "I trusted you. I told you things about myself, about Thomas, about my fear sand. You've been deceiving me this whole time." "I never meant for it to go this far." His voice was quiet, pained. "When I first arrived, I was just grateful for shelter. I didn't expect to—" He gestured helplessly between them. "I didn't expect this." "Expect what?" "To start caring about the naive widow you were amusing yourself with. That's not fair, and you know it." Now there was steel in his voice. "What I feel for you is real, Eliza May. More real than anything I've felt in years. How can I believe that when you won't even tell me who you really are?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Silas Gray. That part's true, but I'm not a traveling man. I own—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I own the largest cattle operation in Montana Territory." The words hit her like a thunderbolt. She stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man who'd been chopping her wood and mending her fences for over a week. "You're rich." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How rich?" "Rich enough that $300 wouldn't even register as an expense." The implications crashed over her in waves. He could have solved her problems with the bank without even thinking about it. He could have told her the truth days ago and saved her all this anguish. Instead, he'd watched her suffer, had let her believe her situation was hopeless. "Get out!" The words came out flat, deadly quiet. "Eliza May." "Get out of my house." She turned away from him, unable to bear looking at his face. "I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear your explanations. I just want you gone." "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you thought it would be entertaining to play at being poor. How you enjoyed watching me worry about losing everything while you could have helped all along." Her voice was rising now, all her hurt and anger pouring out. "Did you think this was some kind of game?" No, it was never a game. His voice was desperate now. I came here by accident, Eliza May. I was traveling alone because I needed to get away from my life, from people who only saw my money. When you took me in, you saw me as just a man. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? She whirled to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. So you decided to lie to me instead of trusting me with the truth. You let me fall in love with someone who doesn't even exist. The admission that she loved him hung between them like a bridge neither could cross, his face crumpled with pain. I exist, Eliza May. The man who's been here with you, the man who's learned to love you. That's who I really am. The money, the business, that's just what I do. It's not who I am. How can I ever believe anything you tell me again? She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to regain her composure. How do I know this isn't just another lie, another role you're playing? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather portfolio. With shaking hands, he opened it and showed her official documents, bank papers, property deeds, business agreements, all bearing the name Silas Gray, all showing holdings that made her head spin. This is who I am in the world, he said quietly. But the man who's been here with you, who's found peace in your kitchen and joy in your company, that's who I am in my heart. She stared at the papers, seeing confirmation of wealth beyond her imagination. Cattle ranches stretching across 3 territories, holdings in banks and railroads. A business empire that made her small homestead look like a child's toy. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice was barely a whisper now, all the fight gone out of her. Because I was afraid you'd see the money instead of the man. Because I was afraid you'd think I was trying to buy your affection. Because, his voice broke. Because for the first time in my adult life, someone loved me for who I am, not what I have. She looked up at him then, seeing the truth written in his eyes. He was afraid this powerful, wealthy man was genuinely afraid of losing her, but the betrayal still burned in her chest like acid. I need you to leave, Silas. I need time to think about this. How much time? I don't know. She turned away again, unable to bear the hope in his expression. Maybe forever. She heard him gather his things, heard the door close behind him, heard his horse's hooves disappearing into the night. Only then did she allow herself to collapse into Thomas's chair and sob until she had no tears left. Outside, the wind howled across the empty prairie, and for the first time since Silas's arrival, she felt truly alone. 3 days passed in lonely silence. Eliza moved through her daily routine like a sleepwalker, feeding the animals, maintaining the fire, preparing simple meals she barely touched. The house felt cavernous without Silas's presence, every corner echoing with memories of their conversations, their shared laughter, their kiss in the snow. She'd replayed their final confrontation countless times, examining every word, every expression. Part of her understood his fear, hadn't she herself been terrified of opening her heart again? But understanding didn't ease the sting of deception or answer the fundamental question of whether anything between them had been real. On the 4th morning after his departure, she was startled from her melancholy by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, she saw Harold Pemberton returning, but this time he was accompanied by a different group of men-roof-looking characters who sat their horses with the easy confidence of those accustomed to enforcing their will. "Mrs. Barnes," Pemberton called as she stepped onto the porch. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." "I have 5 more days before your deadline," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Circumstances have changed, I'm afraid." Pemberton dismounted, but his companions remained mounted, a clear intimidation tactic. "My clients have grown impatient. They're prepared to increase their offer to $450, but only if you sign today. And if I refuse?" Pemberton's smile was cold. "Then I'm afraid we'll have to proceed with foreclosure immediately. These gentlemen represent certain interests that don't appreciate being kept waiting." One of the mounted men spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Awful isolated out here for a woman alone," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "Accidents happen in winter. Fires, mostly. Terrible thing when folks can't get help in time." Fear shot through Eliza like ice water, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Are you threatening me?" "Just pointing out realities, ma'am," the man replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Pemberton held out a sheaf of papers. "The sale documents are all prepared. Sign them, take the money, and be done with this unpleasantness." Before Eliza could respond, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats made them all turn. A group of riders was cresting the hill at full gallop, and even at a distance, she could see the purposeful way they moved. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider, and her heart nearly stopped. Silas rode at the front of what appeared to be a small army of cowboys, his face set in grim determination. Behind him came at least a dozen men, all well armed and riding with the precision of a military unit. But what caught her attention was the map one of the riders carried, a detailed survey map that seemed to show far more than just her small homestead. "Well," Pemberton said, his voice tight with sudden nervousness, "Mr. Gray returns, with friends, I see." Silas dismounted with fluid grace, his grey eyes fixed on Pemberton with an intensity that made the banker take an involuntary step backward. But it was the deference of his men that truly shocked Eliza. These weren't just cowboys. They were professionals who clearly held Silas in the highest regard. "Pemberton," Silas said, his voice carrying an authority she'd never heard before, "you're trespassing. This is business between the bank and Mrs. Barnes." "No." Silas stepped closer, and suddenly Pemberton looked very small indeed. "This is business between you and me. It always has been." He nodded to one of his men, who unrolled the map with a flourish. Eliza gasped as she saw what it revealed: a detailed survey of the entire valley, with property lines clearly marked. Her small homestead was there, but it was surrounded by vast tracts of land, all bearing the same marking: Gray Ranch Holdings. "You see, Pemberton," Silas continued, his voice deceptively calm, "Mrs. Barnes's property sits right in the middle of my grazing range, has for years. I've been letting her late husband use it out of neighborly kindness, but I never sold it." "That's impossible," Pemberton sputtered. "We have clear title." "You have title to a homestead claim that was filed fraudulently." Silas's lawyer, that's clearly what the well-dressed man stepping forward was, produced another set of documents. "Mr. Barnes was never eligible for that particular 160 acres because it was already owned by the Gray Ranch. The original filing was processed by a clerk who failed to check existing ownership records." Eliza stared at the map, trying to process what she was seeing. "According to the survey, her property, the land Thomas had died believing was their shad, belonged to Silas all along. Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "Mr. Gray has documentation showing that the bank's foreclosure proceedings are invalid, as they're attempting to seize property that was never legally owned by the deceased." Pemberton's face had gone white. "This is preposterous. I've never heard of any Gray Ranch in this area." "Haven't you?" Silas's voice turned dangerous. "Strange, considering you've been doing business with my agents for the past 2 years. Trying to buy up small properties throughout this valley, always through intermediaries, always for less than fair market value." He nodded again, and another of his men produced a thick folder. "Contracts, correspondence, financial records, all showing how you've been systematically pressuring homesteaders to sell, using your position at the bank to create artificial emergencies. You've been running a land grab," Eliza said, the pieces suddenly falling into place, "creating false crises to force people to sell cheap." "And selling to whom?" Silas asked softly. "Who's been buying all these supposedly worthless properties?" Pemberton's silence was answer enough. One of his rough companions started to reach for his gun, but suddenly found himself facing a dozen armed cowboys who'd moved with silent efficiency to surround the group. "I'd advise against that," Silas said mildly. "My men don't like it when people threaten women." But Eliza barely heard the exchange. She was staring at the map, at the vast expanse of Gray Ranch holdings that surrounded her tiny homestead like an ocean around an island. The implications crashed over her in waves. "You've owned this land all along," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas turned to her, and she saw pain flicker across his features. "Yes." Thomas and we've been living on your property for 3 years. Yes, you could have thrown us off at any time. I could have, but I didn't. Why? The word came out as a broken sob. Because Thomas Barnes was a good man trying to build something with his wife. Because this valley was big enough for one small homestead. Because, he paused, his eyes searching her face. Because even before I met you, I admired what you two were building here. Pemberton chose that moment to make his move, spurring his horse toward the trail, but he'd barely gone a dozen yards before 2 of Silas's men cut him off, their intentions clear. You'll want to return those forged documents to the bank. Silas called after him, and cancel any foreclosure proceedings. Also, I believe Mrs. Barnes is owed compensation for the distress you've caused her. This isn't over, Gray, Pemberton snarled. Yes, it is. Silas's voice carried final authority. And if I hear of you troubling any more homesteaders in this territory, you'll find yourself dealing with more than just legal paperwork. After Pemberton and his men rode away, Eliza found herself alone with Silas and his small army. The Cowboys had withdrawn to a respectful distance, but their presence reminded her of the vast gulf between her world and his. How long have you known, she asked, about Thomas filing a claim on your land? Since the day after his funeral. Silas's voice was quiet. My land agent brought me the paperwork, honest mistake by a clerk who didn't check the ownership records properly. But you let us stay. You'd just lost your husband. Throwing you off the land would have been cruel. He paused. I thought maybe in spring, when your grief had eased, I'd approach you about making proper arrangements. What kind of arrangements? Selling you the homestead legally, for a fair price, on terms you could afford. He gestured to the map still spread on the ground. That 160 acres doesn't mean much to an operation my size, but it's your home. I never intended to take that away from you. She stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew. So, when Pemberton came with his ultimatum, I realized someone was manipulating your situation. I spent 3 days in town, uncovering the full scope of his land grab scheme. His grey eyes met hers. I wasn't going to let anyone take your home, Eliza May. Not Pemberton, not anyone. Because you own it. Because you belong here. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. This land may be mine legally, but it's yours in every way that matters. She looked around at the homestead she and Thomas had built, seeing it now with new eyes. All their struggles, their sacrifices, their dreams of ownership, they'd been building their lives on land that belonged to the wealthiest man in the territory. I don't understand, she said finally. If you're who you say you are, if you own all this, why were you traveling alone? Why did you need shelter from a winter storm? Silas dismissed his men with a gesture, and they rode away with quiet efficiency, leaving the 2 of them alone in the snowy yard. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from his soul. Because I was running away, Eliza May, from the business, from the responsibilities, from a life that felt more like a prison than a privilege. He looked out over the vast expanse of his holdings. When you're Silas Gray, the cattle baron, everyone wants something from you. Everyone has an angle, a scheme, a reason to pretend friendship. I hadn't had a genuine conversation with another human being in years. So you decided to pretend to be someone else. I decided to find out who I really was underneath all the money and power. He turned back to her. And I found out I was a man who could be happy chopping wood and mending fences as long as it was with the right woman. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Eliza felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd learned. The man she'd fallen in love with was real, but he came with complications she'd never imagined. I need time to think about this, she said finally. I know you do. He remounted his horse, then paused. For what it's worth, Eliza May, every moment we shared was real. My feelings for you, the man I became here with you, that's the truth, even if nothing else was. As he rode away, Eliza stood alone in her yard, staring at the map that redefined everything she thought she knew about her life. The land beneath her feet belonged to Silas Gray, but somehow that felt less important than the question of whether her heart could forgive him for not trusting her with the truth from the beginning. The revelations of the previous day had left Eliza feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted permanently. She spent a sleepless night pacing her small house, trying to make sense of everything she'd learned. By dawn, she was exhausted, but no closer to understanding how she felt about Silas's deceptions or his protections. She was feeding the chickens when Martha Henderson's wagon appeared on the horizon, moving faster than usual. As her neighbor drew closer, Eliza could see the worry etched on Martha's face. "Eliza May," Martha called, barely waiting for her wagon to stop before climbing down. "Thank heavens you're all right. We heard there was trouble yesterday, armed men. Threats. John wanted to come check on you immediately, but the snow started again and—" "I'm fine, Martha." Eliza led her neighbor toward the house, grateful for the company despite everything. "It was Harold Pemberton and some associates. Nothing I couldn't handle." "Pemberton? That snake. I always suspected something wasn't right about his business dealings." Martha stamped snow from her boots before entering the warm kitchen. "But we also heard Mr. Gray returned, with quite a company of men." Eliza busied herself preparing coffee, using the familiar ritual to buy time while she decided how much to share. "He did. And it turns out Mr. Gray isn't quite who I thought he was." Martha's eyebrows rose. "I had wondered. John said he had the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. What did you discover?" Eliza poured the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "He's Silas Gray, the Silas Gray." The cup Martha had been raising to her lips stopped halfway. "The cattle baron? The one who owns half of Montana Territory?" "Apparently." Martha set down her cup with a sharp clink. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, and he's been here, in your house, pretending to be a common traveler?" "For over a week." Eliza sank into her chair, suddenly feeling very tired. "He let me feed him from my mother's recipes, watched me worry about losing my home, listened to me pour my heart out about Thomas and my fears for the future, all while knowing he could solve my problems with pocket change." "But why would a man like that—" Martha stopped, studying Eliza's face with sharp eyes. "Oh, my dear, you fell in love with him." It wasn't a question, and Eliza didn't try to deny it. "I thought I was falling in love with a kind stranger who understood my grief. Instead, I was falling in love with the richest man in the territory who was playing at being poor." "Was he playing, though?" Martha leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "I mean, could a man fake the kind of gentleness John described, the way he spoke about you, defended your honor? I don't know what was real and what was performance." Eliza traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "He says his feelings were genuine, but how can I trust anything he tells me now?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table to cover Eliza's hand with her own. "What does your heart tell you?" "My heart is a fool. It still aches for him, even knowing what I know." "Then maybe your heart knows something your head hasn't figured out yet." Before Eliza could respond, they heard the approach of another horse. Through the window, she saw a lone rider, not Silas, but a well-dressed man she didn't recognize. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone who spent more time in offices than on horseback. "Mrs. Barnes?" The man's voice was cultured, professional. "I'm Edward Morrison, attorney for Mr. Silas Gray. Might I have a word with you?" Eliza invited him in, and Martha made motions to leave, but Morrison gestured for her to stay. "This concerns the entire community, actually. Mrs. Henderson, isn't it? Your husband owns the property adjacent to Mrs. Barnes." "That's right," Martha said warily. Morrison opened his leather satchel and withdrew a thick document. "I've been instructed by Mr. Gray to present Mrs. Barnes with this." Eliza took the papers with trembling hands. The legal language was dense, but the essentials were clear enough. Silas was formally deeding her the 160 acres that comprised her homestead, along with a substantial cash settlement to cover improvements and ensure her financial security. "This can't be right," she said, scanning the numbers. "This amount is more than the land is worth." Mr. Gray was quite specific about the valuation. He said you and your late husband invested 3 years of labor and love into improvements. He wanted that compensated fairly. Martha leaned over to read the document, her eyes widening. Eliza May, this is more money than most people see in a lifetime. But why? Eliza looked up at Morrison. Why would he do this? I believe his exact words were that the land belongs to you in every way that matters, and the law should reflect that reality. Morrison's professional demeanor softened slightly. If I may speak personally, Mrs. Barnes, I've known Mr. Gray for 15 years. I've never seen him make a decision like this, giving away valuable property for purely sentimental reasons. He's a shrewd businessman, but this isn't business. This is his heart speaking. After Morrison left, Eliza sat staring at the deed that made her a legitimate landowner and a wealthy woman in her own right. The irony wasn't lost on Hirsch. She'd struggled for months to find $300 to save her home, and now she possessed more money than she'd ever dreamed of. He's trying to buy your forgiveness, Martha said gently. Is he? Or is he trying to salve his conscience? Eliza folded the papers carefully. Maybe he thinks if he throws enough money at the problem, I'll forget that he lied to me for over a week. Or maybe he's trying to prove that his feelings for you had nothing to do with your circumstances. You can't be accused of being a fortune hunter now. You have your own fortune. The insight struck Eliza like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on his deception that she hadn't considered this angle. By making her financially independent, Silas had removed any question about the motivations behind their relationship. If they came together now, it would be as equals, with neither party having financial leverage over the other. Martha, she said slowly, what would you do if you were me? Her friend was quiet for a long moment. I'd ask myself whether I was angrier about the lies or about discovering that the man I loved was more than I thought he was. That afternoon, alone again, Eliza found herself drawn to a wooden box she'd tucked away in her bedroom, a box containing documents that suddenly seemed very important. Thomas's original homestead filing, their marriage certificate, the letters of recommendation that had helped them secure their claim. But there was something else in the box, something she'd forgotten about. Silas's original will, a document that had somehow been left behind when he'd gathered his things. She unfolded it with curiosity, then sat down hard on the bed as she read its contents. The will was dated just 2 months before his arrival at her homestead. It was a cold, business-like document that distributed his vast wealth among various charities and business associates. But what struck her most was what it revealed about his life. No wife, no children, no close family members. The richest man in Montana Territory was completely alone in the world. Attached to the will was a letter, in Silas's handwriting, apparently intended for his lawyer. The words made her heart ache. Edward, I'm writing this because I've come to realize that I've built an empire but forgotten to build a life. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but I can't remember the last time I had a genuine conversation with another human being. Everyone wants something from me: investment, partnership, favor, influence. I don't know who I am anymore, apart from what I own, and I'm not sure that person is worth knowing. The letter went on to detail his plan to travel incognito, to see if he could find some meaning beyond business success. There was a desperation in the words that painted a picture of a man so isolated by his wealth that he'd forgotten how to be simply human. I want to know if anyone could care for Silas the man, rather than Silas Gray the cattle baron. I want to find out if I'm capable of being loved for who I am, not what I have. If this journey teaches me nothing else, I hope it reminds me what it feels like to be real. Eliza read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely by the end. This wasn't the writing of a man playing games or amusing himself with a poor widow's affections. This was the writing of someone desperately lonely, someone who had everything the world said should matter but had lost the things that actually did matter. When she heard approaching hoofbeats that evening, she looked out to see not Silas, but a messenger from town. The young man handed her an envelope with her name written in Silas's careful script. Inside was a brief note. Eliza May, I know you need time to think about everything that's happened. I'm returning to my ranch, but I wanted you to know that I'll wait as long as it takes for your answer. The deed is yours, regardless of your decision about us. The land belongs to you, and so does my heart. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice. With all my love, Silas." Attached to the note was a hand-drawn map showing the location of the Grey Ranch headquarters, about 30 miles northeast of her homestead. At the bottom, in smaller writing, he'd added, "If you come, ask for the man who loves you, not the man who owns the ranch." That night, Eliza lay in bed holding Thomas's letters in one hand and Silas's original will in the other. Two very different men, two very different kinds of love. Thomas had loved the woman she was, the safe, predictable version of herself that fit neatly into his dreams. Silas seemed to love the woman she could become, the version of herself that was strong enough to forgive, brave enough to trust again. The question was, which version of herself did she want to be? Outside, the wind had died down, and for the first time in weeks, she could see stars through her bedroom window. Clear skies were coming, which meant travel would be possible soon. If she was going to make a choice about her future, the time for deciding was at hand. She thought about the deed that made her a landowner, about the will that revealed Silas's desperate loneliness, about the letter that showed his genuine desire to be loved for himself rather than his wealth. Most of all, she thought about the way he'd looked at her when he said her name, as if she was something precious beyond measure. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe her heart did know something her head hadn't figured out yet, and maybe it was time to listen to what it was trying to tell her. Eliza woke the next morning with a clarity that surprised her. The decision had crystallized during the night, not through careful reasoning but through a deeper knowing that seemed to come from her bones. She dressed in her best wool dress, the blue one Thomas had always complimented, and braided her hair with unusual care. From her father's old trunk, she retrieved the rifle he'd given her when she'd first moved west. It was a fine piece, well-maintained and reliable, and it had seen her through more than one dangerous situation. Today, she hoped, would not be one of those times, but in this country, a woman traveling alone was wise to be prepared. Martha arrived, just as Eliza was hitching the wagon, as if some intuition had told her this day would be different. "You're going to him," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Eliza checked the harness one final time, her movements brisk and purposeful. "I spent all night thinking about forgiveness and trust and what love really means. I realized I was asking the wrong questions." "What questions should you have been asking?" Eliza paused in her preparations, her hand resting on the wagon's side. "Not whether he lied to me, but why he felt he had to. Not whether I can trust him with my heart, but whether I'm brave enough to trust myself with his." Martha smiled. "That sounds like wisdom." "It sounds terrifying." Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat, the rifle secure beside her. "But staying afraid feels worse than being brave." The journey to the Grey Ranch took most of the morning. The road was clearer than she'd expected, well-maintained despite the winter weather, and she made good time across the rolling prairie. As she crested a hill and saw the ranch headquarters spread out below her, she understood for the first time the true scope of Silas's holdings. The main house was a sprawling structure of stone and timber that managed to look both grand and welcoming. Barns and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and she could see hundreds of cattle grazing in the distant pastures. Men worked with quiet efficiency around the corrals, their movements speaking of an operation run with military precision. But what struck her most was how the ranch seemed to fit naturally into the landscape, as if it had grown from the earth rather than been imposed upon it. This wasn't the ostentatious display of new wealth, but something built with care and respect for the land itself. A cowboy approached as she drove up to the main house, tipping his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" "I'm looking for Silas Gray," she said, then remembered his note. "The man who loves me, not the man who owns the ranch." The cowboy's weathered face broke into a grin. "Yes, ma'am. He's been expecting you. Said to tell you he'd be in the small cabin by the creek if you came calling." He gave her directions to a path that led away from the main buildings, winding through a grove of cottonwoods toward the sound of running water. Eliza followed it on foot, leaving the wagon tied at the main house, her father's rifle slung across her shoulder, more from habit than necessity. The cabin, when she found it, was nothing like what she'd expected. It was small and simple, built of logs that had weathered to a soft grey. Smoke rose from its chimney, and through the windows she could see the warm glow of lamplight. It looked like the kind of place a man might go to remember who he was before the world told him who he should be. Silas appeared in the doorway before she could knock, as if he'd been watching for her from the window. He looked different here, younger somehow, less burdened. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and worn jeans, and his feet were bare despite the cold. Eliza May. Her name on his lips was like a prayer answered. "Hello, Silas." She shifted the rifle's strap on her shoulder, suddenly feeling foolish for bringing it. "I got your letter." "And?" She studied his face, seeing hope and fear warring in his grey eyes. "And I realized I've been asking myself the wrong questions." He stepped aside to let her enter the cabin, and she found herself in a space that felt immediately familiar. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with a stone fireplace, a few books scattered on a table, and the lingering smell of coffee and wood smoke. This wasn't the lair of a cattle baron, this was the home of the man who'd sat by her fire and mended her harnesses. "I've been doing some thinking too," he said, closing the door behind her, "about truth and trust and whether love can survive mistakes." "What conclusions did you reach?" "That I'd rather spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness than one more day living without you." His voice was quiet, steady. "That I'd give up everything I own for the chance to chop wood in your yard again." She set down the rifle, leaning it carefully against the wall. "That's quite an offer from the richest man in Montana Territory." "The richest man in Montana Territory is miserable and alone. The man who loves you is the happiest I've ever been." They stood facing each other across the small room, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "Silas," she said finally, "I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. Anything. If I hadn't found that will, if your lawyer hadn't explained about the deed, if I never learned who you really were, would you have told me eventually?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "I don't know. I wanted to, every single day. But I was terrified that once you knew, everything between us would change. That you'd see the money instead of the man." He stepped closer. "I was a coward, Eliza May. I was so afraid of losing what we had that I risked losing it anyway." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged. But it was the answer she'd needed to hear, not because it excused his deception, but because it was true. "Well," she said, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, "I suppose we're both going to have to be braver from now on." The touch of her fingers against his cheek seemed to break something loose inside Silas. He closed his eyes and leaned into her hand, and she felt the tension he'd been carrying drain away like water from a broken dam. "I've been so afraid," he whispered. "Afraid that I'd ruined everything, afraid that you'd never trust me again, afraid that I'd have to live the rest of my life knowing I'd lost the only real thing I'd ever found." "You haven't lost me," she said softly. "But Silas, if we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build something real together, it has to be built on truth, complete truth. No more secrets, no more protection through deception." He opened his eyes, and she saw her own resolve reflected back at her. "No more secrets," he agreed. "Ask me anything you want to know." "All right." She moved to the fireplace, needing the warmth and the moment to gather her thoughts. "Tell me about Margaret, the woman you were going to marry." His face tightened, but he didn't look away. "Margaret Ashford, beautiful, accomplished, from a good family back east. We met at a social function in Denver 3 years ago, and I was captivated. She was everything I thought I wanted in a wife." "What happened?" "I let her believe I was someone I wasn't. Not about the money. She knew about that from the beginning. but I presented myself as a gentleman rancher, someone who dabbled in cattle for the romance of it. I took her to the opera, bought her jewelry, spoke French with her over candlelit dinners. His voice grew bitter. I never showed her the reality of what I actually do, the 18-hour days during calving season, the blood and mud and backbreaking work. Eliza settled into the chair across from him, sensing there was more to the story. When she finally visited the ranch, the real ranch, not the pretty parlor I'd shown her in town, she lasted exactly 2 days. Said she'd thought she was marrying a refined businessman, not a common rancher who smelled of cattle and leather. Silas stared into the fire. She wasn't wrong to leave. I'd lied to her about who I was, just like I lied to you. Except you lied in opposite directions, Eliza observed. With her, you hid how rough your life really was. With me, you hid how refined you could be. Because with her, I was ashamed of being common. With you, I was ashamed of being wealthy. He looked at her directly. With you, I wanted to be judged for my character, not my bank account. She understood then, in a way that went deeper than logic. You've never had anyone love you for just yourself. Not since my mother died when I was 12. The admission seemed to surprise him. My father raised me to take over the business, and every relationship since then has been about what I could do for other people, or what they could do for me. Eliza reached into her coat pocket and withdrew something small and circular. She held it up to the firelight, and Silas's breath caught as he recognized it. It was a simple gold wedding band knot, the one Thomas had given her, but a new one, plain, unadorned, the kind a man might buy with honest wages rather than inherited wealth. I had the jeweler in town make this, she said. It's nothing fancy, nothing that would impress anyone. It's just a simple ring for a simple promise. Silas stared at it as if it were the most precious thing he'd ever seen. Eliza May. I'm not asking you to propose to me, she said quickly. I'm proposing to you. The words hung in the air between them, bold and terrifying and absolutely right. Silas went very still, his grey eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. You're proposing to me? I'm proposing to Silas, the man who chopped my wood and mended my fences and listened to my stories by the fire. The man who was kind to my animals and gentle with my grief. The man who made me laugh for the first time since Thomas died. She held out the ring. I don't care about your ranch or your money or your business empire. I care about the man who was brave enough to trust me with his heart, even if it took him a while to trust me with his truth. Silas rose from his chair and knelt before her, his hands shaking as he reached for the ring. Are you sure? Because once I say yes, I'm never letting you go again. I'll follow you to the ends of the earth if necessary. I'm sure. She placed the ring in his palm, then covered his hands with both of hers. But I'm not going to the ends of the earth. I'm going home to my homestead. I'm hoping you'll come with me. As your husband? As my partner. In everything. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. What do you say, Silas Gray? Will you marry a woman who's brave enough to propose, stubborn enough to forgive you, and crazy enough to think she can make you happy? He slipped the ring onto his finger, and it fit as perfectly as if it had been made for him. Which, she supposed, it had been. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes to everything. Yes to partnership. Yes to marriage. Yes to building a life together that's more real than anything either of us has ever had. When he kissed her then, it was with the desperate joy of a man who'd thought he'd lost everything and discovered he'd found more than he'd ever dreamed possible. And when she kissed him back, it was with the full confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing and why. Outside the small cabin, snow began to fall again, but inside, by the warmth of the fire, two people who'd been afraid to trust were learning that love, real love, was worth every risk they'd taken to find it. 6 months later, on a brilliant morning in early June, Eliza May Barnes stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the ivory silk dress that had been her mother's. The fabric was old but lovingly preserved, and with Martha's help, it had been altered to fit her perfectly. Through the open window, she could hear the sounds of preparation wagons arriving, voices calling greetings, the laughter of children playing in the yard. Today was her wedding day. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha said, fastening the pearl buttons at the back of the dress. "Thomas would be happy for you, you know. He'd want you to love again." Eliza touched the small locket at her throat, Thomas's final gift to her, which she'd decided to wear today not as a reminder of the past, but as a bridge between who she'd been and who she was becoming. "I think he would," she agreed. "He always said life was meant to be lived fully, not safely." Through the window, she could see guests gathering on the hillside, where she and Silas had decided to hold the ceremony. The spot overlooked the valley where Thomas's apple tree stake still stood, now surrounded by young saplings that Silas had planted as a wedding gift. "For our children to climb," he'd said, and the casual assumption of their shared future had filled her heart to overflowing. The combined land deed lay framed on her Dresserthe document that officially merged her homestead with a portion of Silas's ranch, creating something new that belonged to both of them equally. It had taken months of legal work to structure the arrangement properly, but Silas had insisted on it. "I want us to be true partners," he'd said, "in law as well as in love." Pastor Williams had arrived from town the day before, along with nearly every family within 50 miles. Word of the engagement between the widow Barnes and the cattle baron had spread quickly, and what might have been a simple ceremony had grown into a community celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by neighbors, and a small army of children raced between the adults, their excitement infectious. "Are you ready?" Martha asked, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Eliza looked once more in the mirror, seeing not the grieving widow who'd found a half-frozen stranger in her barn, but a woman who'd learned to trust her own heart again. "I'm ready." They walked outside together, where John Henderson waited to escort her down the hillside. Silas had no family to speak of, and Eliza's father had died years ago, so they'd agreed that their neighbors would serve as family for this day. "You sure about this, Eliza May?" John asked with a gentle smile as he offered his arm. "It's not too late to run off and leave him at the altar." "I'm sure," she laughed, "though I suspect if I ran, he'd follow me to the ends of the earth." "Damn right I would," came a familiar voice from behind them. She turned to find Silas approaching, and her breath caught. He wore a simple black suit, well-tailored but not ostentatious, and in his hands he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. But what made her heart skip was the expression on his face of pure joy mixed with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "You're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony," Martha scolded, but she was smiling. "I've spent too many days not seeing her," Silas replied, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "I'm not missing a moment more than I have to." He handed her the wildflowers, lupines, an Indian paintbrush, prairie roses and wild minthand. She buried her face in their sweet fragrance. "They're perfect." "Not as perfect as you." He touched her cheek, gently. "Thank you for taking a chance on a foolish man who nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to him. Thank you for being worth the chance." The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. Pastor Williams spoke about love and partnership, about the courage it takes to trust another person with your future. When it came time for vows, Eliza and Silas had written their own. "I promise to trust you with my truth," Silas said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "to be brave enough to be myself with you, and to love you not in spite of your strength, but because of it. I promise to be brave enough to build a new life without forgetting the old one," Eliza replied. "To trust you with my heart and my dreams, and to believe that love is worth every risk we take to find it." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their friends and neighbors could probably be heard in town. Silas kissed her with such tenderness and joy that she felt tears spring to her eyes, and when they broke apart, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears as well. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and music and more food than 50 people could possibly eat. Eliza found herself swept up in the joy of it, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who'd watched her struggle through grief and were genuinely happy to see her find love again. As the sun began to set, she and Silas slipped away from the crowd to walk the boundaries of their combined property. The land stretched out before them, vast and promising, and she could see the future taking shape in her mind. The horse breeding program she wanted to start, the school she might teach in winter, the children who would grow up running through these fields. "Any regrets?" Silas asked, as they stood hand in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," she replied. "What about you?" "Only that I was foolish enough to almost let fear keep me from the best thing in my life." He squeezed her hand. "But maybe that's what makes it precious, knowing how easily we could have missed it." They walked back toward the house, their house now as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Behind them lay two different kinds of loneliness, two different kinds of loss, two different kinds of fear. Ahead lay the unknown territory of marriage, partnership, and shared dreams. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. Sometimes, Eliza thought, the best journeys were the ones you never planned to take, and the best destinations were the ones you found in the most unexpected places. Like love blooming in the heart of a Montana winter, turning strangers into soulmates and making a house into a home.